She stood on a wooden platform in 30-degree wind, wearing everything she owned, while men laughed at her price tag. Nobody wanted her. Nobody believed in her. And the one man who finally raised his hand wasn't doing her any favors. He just needed someone desperate enough to stay. What happened next on that broken-down ranch in the middle of nowhere would silence an entire territory. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off before you even opened your mouth, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The wind came off the flats like something personal. It cut through the crowd gathered outside Harlan's Feed and Dry Goods on the last Thursday of October 1883, slicing through wool coats and leather vests without apology. The sky above Caldwell Creek was the color of an old bruise, yellow at the edges, deep purple toward the center, and the kind of cold that settles into your back teeth had already arrived a full month ahead of schedule. Nobody seemed to mind. There was entertainment to be had. The labor platform had been built sometime in the previous decade from rough pine planks that had since warped and grayed in the sun. It sat between the general store and the livery, elevated maybe 3 feet off the frozen mud, and on most auction days it held farm equipment, mules, or the occasional wagon. Today, it held people. Maren Holloway stood third in line. She was 31 years old, though the last 18 months had aged her in ways that didn't show up cleanly on a face. She was a big woman, broad through the shoulders, heavy in the hips, with thick hands that had never been soft even in her better years. Her dark hair was pulled back without ceremony, her dress was brown wool, patched at both elbows, and her boots were a half size too large because they'd belonged to someone else first. She carried no bag. Everything she owned was on her body. She had arrived in Caldwell Creek 4 days earlier on the back of a grain wagon, having walked out of a rooming house in Abilene with 40 cents and a letter of reference from a woman named Clara Fitch, who had since died of fever. The letter was useless. The 40 cents were gone by the second day. A deputy named Hodge, who had kind eyes and an apologetic manner, had explained to her that without documented employment or family claim, the county had legal authority to place her in contracted labor for up to 1 calendar year. "It's that or the workhouse," he'd said, not unkindly. She'd chosen the platform. Now she stood in line behind a teenage boy who kept wiping his nose on his sleeve and a middle-aged man with a bandaged hand who smelled like turpentine, and she watched the small crowd assembled below with the expression of someone who had decided, quietly and privately, that they were not going to break her today. There were maybe 30 people, farmers mostly, a few merchants, 2 women standing together near the back who watched the proceedings with tight mouths and folded arms, the kind of women who disapproved of the auction but had come to watch anyway. The auctioneer was a man named Fletcher, built like a fence post, with a voice that carried all the way to the creek. "Next up," Fletcher called, after the boy had been contracted to a wheat farmer for $11 a month, "Maren Holloway, age 31, no dependents, previous employment, domestic service, Abilene. References available upon request." He paused, shuffled his paper, and added with the bored professionalism of a man who had done this 100 times, "She's in good health." That was the entirety of her introduction. Maren stepped forward to the front edge of the platform and looked out at the crowd. The cold pressed against her face. A few men in the front row said nothing, but their expression said enough. A quick assessment, a small smirk, a glance exchanged with a neighbor. She heard something muttered, couldn't make out the words. Didn't need to. She straightened her back and set her jaw and kept her eyes level. $10, said a voice from the left side of the crowd. A heavy-set man in a green coat. He was already looking away before the word finished leaving his mouth, as if the bid itself were more of a comment than an offer. Silence. Fletcher waited. $10. Do I hear 12? More silence. Someone near the back laughed. Short, quiet, the kind of laugh that isn't meant to be heard, but is. One of the women near the rear turned and walked away without looking back. Maren did not move. $10 going once? 15. The voice came from the far edge of the crowd, near the corner of the livery. The man standing there looked like he'd been carved from the same material as the frontier itself. Tall, weathered, with the kind of face that had stopped being young sometime around 40 and had simply become permanent. He wore a dark coat that had seen better weather and a hat pulled low against the wind. He held it with both hands in front of him, turning it slightly, the way a man does when he's not entirely comfortable with what he's doing. He was not looking at Marin. He was looking at Fletcher. Fletcher blinked. 15 from Ashcroft, the man said. Gideon Ashcroft, out on the Flat Creek Road. A shift moved through the crowd. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle rearrangement of posture, a few heads turning, a murmur that passed from one person to another like a draft under a door. Marin didn't understand what it meant yet. She would later. $15. Any advance on 15? The heavy-set man in the green coat looked at Gideon Ashcroft, then at Marin, then apparently decided that $15 was more than he wanted to spend on a complication, and turned away. $15 going once, going twice. Fletcher's hammer came down. Sold to Gideon Ashcroft. He didn't speak to her for the first hour. He signed the contract with Fletcher, tucked his copy into his coat, and walked toward a wagon hitched outside the livery. A broad, flat-bedded thing pulled by two bay horses that looked reliable rather than beautiful. He didn't offer to help her up. He didn't explain anything. He simply climbed to the front bench, gathered the reins, and waited. Marin climbed up herself and sat down beside him with her hands folded in her lap. The wagon rolled out of Caldwell Creek through the brown afternoon, and neither of them said a word for a long time. The town disappeared behind them. The land opened up, wide and flat and colorless under the October sky, broken only by distant tree lines and the occasional dark smear of a distant homestead. The wind was at their backs now, which was the only mercy. She watched the country passing and thought about what she knew, which wasn't much. A ranch, 9 children, a contract that ran 12 months with housing and meals included and $3 a month beyond that. She finally said, "How old are they?" He glanced at her, just a look, quick, measuring. "The youngest is 4, the oldest is 17. All yours?" A pause. "All mine." "Their mother?" The line of his jaw tightened. 3 years gone. Marin nodded once and looked back at the road. "I'm not looking for a replacement," he said. The words came out flat and deliberate, like he'd rehearsed them. "I need someone who can cook, manage a household, help with the younger ones before and after school. That's the whole of it." "I understand." "Previous women didn't last," he said. "Just so you're clear on that." She turned to look at him directly. "How many previous women?" He didn't answer right away. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm in the frozen dirt. 4, he said at last. "In 3 years." "What happened to them?" "First one left after 2 weeks, said the children were unmanageable." A short exhale, not quite a laugh. "Second stayed 6 weeks, left after the youngest bit her." He paused. "Third one, I'm not sure why she left. She was gone one morning and didn't say. Fourth stayed 3 months, said the isolation was worse than any hardship she'd known." Marin absorbed this. "And you expect I'll do the same?" she said. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, "I'm going to be straightforward with you. I have nowhere else to go. That's not a thing I say to earn your sympathy. It's just the truth. I have no family, no savings, and no outstanding offers, which means that whatever your ranch is, and however difficult your children are, what's waiting for me at the end of that contract is more useful to me than what I left behind." She looked back at the road. "I'm not going to make you promises. I'm going to show up tomorrow morning and do what's needed. That's the only thing I can offer." Gideon Ashcroft was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. That was all. Dead. The ranch appeared at the end of a long track lined with dead cottonwoods. Marin had expected bad. She hadn't expected this. The main house was a 2-story frame structure that had started life with ambition and been slowly defeated by weather and time. One of the second-floor shutters hung at an angle, held by a single hinge. The front porch had a gap in the planking near the door that someone had placed a barrel over rather than repair. The yard was a mess of frozen mud, scattered tools, a broken wagon wheel leaning against the fence, and what appeared to be a chicken that had decided the porch was its home and couldn't be persuaded otherwise. Behind the main house stood a barn that looked structurally sound. A chicken coop, a small smokehouse with a door that didn't quite close, and a root cellar dug into a rise to the west. 3 children were visible in the yard when the wagon pulled in. They stopped what they were doing and watched. They were boys, maybe 8, 10, and 12, at a rough guess, wearing coats that were slightly too small and expressions that were identical, cautious, closed, suspicious in the particular way that children get when they have been repeatedly disappointed by adults who came and then left. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. "Boys," he said, "this is Miss Holloway. She'll be helping with the house." None of them spoke. Marin climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance and stood in the frozen yard. The wind pushed at her. She looked at the three boys with their identical, careful expressions and resisted every instinct she had to smile reassuringly or say something gentle. Instead, she said, "Which one of you knows how to carry a box?" The middle boy, the 10-year-old, blinked. "I do." "Good," she said. "There's a crate in the back of the wagon. Bring it inside." He looked at his father. Gideon gave the smallest nod. The boy went to the wagon. The other two kept watching her. "I'm not going to pretend we're friends," she said to them, matter-of-factly. "That's something that takes time, and I haven't earned it yet. But I'm going to need to know your names because I'm not going to call you boy all winter. It's undignified for both of us." A beat of silence. "Thomas," said the oldest, carefully. "Samuel," said the youngest, which made him the 8-year-old, less carefully. Children that age had less time for caution. "The one carrying the box?" "Eli," said Thomas. "Good," Marin said. "Let's go inside before we all freeze standing here." The interior of the house was cold and smelled like wood smoke, boiled something, and the specific exhaustion of a place that was cleaned rarely and never quite enough. The kitchen occupied most of the ground floor's left side, a large iron range, a work table, open shelves holding mismatched crockery, and jars of things she couldn't identify yet. A cast iron pot sat on the range with something brown congealing in it that had probably been dinner at some point earlier in the week. The parlor on the right had a braided rug that was wearing thin in the center, 2 mismatched chairs, and a sofa with a broken leg propped up by a stack of old almanacs. There were drawings pinned to the wall near the window, children's drawings, dozens of them, overlapping like scales on a fish. Marin noticed a pair of small boots near the stairs, one of them with the sole coming away from the upper. She noticed that the curtains in the parlor had been mended at least 4 times with thread that didn't quite match. She noticed the basket of mending sitting beside the sofa, overflowing, a month of work waiting in it, at least. She noticed all of this in the way a person notices a problem they're about to become responsible for. The remaining 6 children materialized over the next half hour. 2 more boys, 14 and 16, came in from the barn smelling of horses and manure and stopped dead in the doorway when they saw her in the kitchen. A girl of about 12 followed them, saw Marin, and immediately turned around and left the room without saying anything. 2 small girls came down the stairs hand in hand. Twins, Marin guessed, around 6 years old, and stood at the bottom of the stairs staring at her with the round-eyed focus of very young children who have learned to evaluate strangers carefully. And then the oldest. She came in last, through the back door, carrying a pail of milk that she set down on the work table with a controlled thud. She was 17, with her father's coloring and a face that was striking in the way that young faces sometimes are when they're carrying more than they should. Her hair was dark and pinned badly, like she'd done it herself in a hurry and hadn't had time or interest to do it well. She looked at Marin standing in her kitchen. "You're the new one," she said. "I am," Marin agreed. "Where did you put the flour?" Marin glanced at the shelf where the flour had been. She'd moved it to get to the crate Eli had brought in. "Top shelf, right side." "That's not where it goes." "I can move it back." "I'll move it back." The girl crossed the kitchen, reached up to the top shelf, and relocated the flour canister with precise efficiency. Then she turned around. "I'm Clara. I run this house." "You've been running this house," Marin said. "That's different." Clara Ashcroft's eyes went flat and hard. "Is it? It means you've been doing a job that isn't yours to do. I'm not here to criticize what you've built. I can see you've kept this family going, and that's not a small thing, but you're 17. You shouldn't be carrying all of this." "I've been carrying it for 3 years." "I know." The others left. "I know that too." Clara looked at her, really looked at her, the way a person does when they're deciding whether to believe something or protect themselves from it. Her expression didn't soften. "Dinner needs to be ready by 6, she said. "Papa comes in at 5:30. The little ones eat first." "Show me what you have," Marin said. Clara hesitated. One beat, barely visible, and then she opened the pantry door. "What?" That first night, Marin slept in a room off the back of the kitchen that had probably been a storage room and had been cleared out with minimal enthusiasm. A cot with a thin mattress, a hook on the wall, a window that let in cold air through a gap at the bottom she stuffed with a folded rag before she lay down. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the house. She could hear wind in the eaves and the settling of old wood in the cold, and somewhere above her, the soft thump of small feet crossing a floor, then quiet. One of the little girls, maybe. Couldn't sleep. She thought about Caldwell Creek, about the platform and the cold and the 30 people who had looked at her and looked away, about the man in the green coat who had bid $10 and then not bothered to look at her face. She thought about Fletcher's voice. She's in good health. She thought about Clara Ashcroft looking at her across the kitchen with eyes that were equal parts exhaustion and defiance, doing her arithmetic, trying to calculate whether Marin was another name to add to the list of women who had come and gone and left them all worse for hoping. Marin stared at the dark ceiling. She didn't make herself any promises about winning anyone over. She didn't think about the children warming to her or the ranch coming together or any of the tidy futures that people imagined when they told themselves stories about fresh starts. She thought, get up tomorrow, make breakfast, learn the names of everything. That was enough for one night. Outside, the wind moved across the flat country with nothing to slow it down. No hills, no trees dense enough, nothing between here and the horizon that could tell it to stop. It wasn't the kind of land that made you feel welcome. But Marin Holloway had never needed land to welcome her. She closed her eyes. She'd start in the morning. The first week on the Ashcroft Ranch did not break Marin Holloway, but it came close enough that she could feel the edge. She was up before 5 every morning, not because anyone asked her to be, but because the kitchen range needed to be stoked from cold. And if she didn't do it, no one did, and 9 children needed hot food before the day started, or everything fell apart by 8 o'clock. She learned this on the second morning, when she'd allowed herself an extra 30 minutes, and came into the kitchen to find Samuel, the 8-year-old, trying to fry salt pork directly on the range surface because he couldn't get the fire going properly and was hungry and hadn't wanted to wake anyone. "Don't do that," she said, moving him gently aside. "I'm hungry," he said, not complaining, just stating a fact. "I know. Give me 10 minutes. He sat at the table and watched her work with an expression that was half suspicious and half something he was trying not to show. She didn't talk to fill the silence. She just made the fire and made the food and put a plate in front of him before the others came downstairs. He ate without saying thank you. She didn't expect him to. The days were long in a way that had nothing to do with hours. The washing alone took most of Monday. 9 people generated laundry at a rate that was almost admirable, and the wash lines behind the house held everything from work pants stiff with mud to small wool stockings with holes at the toes she'd have to mend later. Tuesday was baking. Wednesday, she spent half the morning trying to figure out why the smokehouse door wouldn't latch properly. It turned out the frame had shifted over the summer, and the whole thing needed to be rehung, and the other half reorganizing the root cellar, which had been packed without any particular system, and where 3 jars of preserved beans had cracked and gone bad sometime in September, taking 2 jars of beets down with them when they dripped. The 2 oldest boys, James, who was 16, and Henry, 14, were polite to her in the way that people are polite to someone they're waiting to leave. They said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and moved out of her way when she came through a room, and that was essentially the extent of their engagement. They did their chores because their father told them to, not because they had any interest in making her life easier. Thomas, the 12-year-old, was quieter than his brothers and watched her more carefully. She sometimes caught him in doorways, not quite entering a room she was working in, just observing. She left him alone. There are children who need to come to things on their own schedule, and pushing them only delays the process. Eli, the 10-year-old who'd carried her crate that first afternoon, was the first one to actually speak to her voluntarily. He came into the kitchen on the 4th morning and said, "You do the stitching differently than Clara." Marin looked up from the shirt she was mending. "Do I?" Clara goes across. "You go around." "It's called a blanket stitch. It holds better on thicker fabric." She held it up so he could see. He looked at it seriously. Does it take longer? A little. He nodded and left. That was the whole conversation. But he came back the next morning and sat at the kitchen table doing his arithmetic while she worked, and she counted that as something. The twins, May and Josie, were 6 years old and attached to each other like a single organism that had been split into two bodies. They went everywhere together, finished each other's sentences, and communicated in a private language of glances that Marin suspected had kept them both sane during the 3 years their mother had been gone. They were not hostile to Marin. They were simply indifferent, the way very young children are when adults cycle in and out of their lives often enough that attachment starts to seem like a waste of energy. Nora, the 12-year-old girl who had turned around and left the room on Marin's first night. She avoided Marin so systematically that it was almost impressive. She took a different route through the kitchen if Marin was in it. She ate quickly and left the table early. She answered questions with the minimum number of words required to technically constitute an answer. And then there was Clara. Clara was the problem, in the center of everything, and Marin understood that quickly. The girl had been running this household since she was 14 years old, cooking, mending, managing the younger children's schedules, making decisions about the pantry and the garden, and what got fixed first when things broke, which was constantly. She had done it without being asked, without complaint, because someone had to, and she was the oldest and there was no one else. She had also, somewhere in the process, become the person this family organized itself around. Not Gideon. He was the authority, the law, the man whose word ended arguments. But Clara was the gravity. The children moved around her. Even the older boys deferred to her in the domestic space of the house. And now Marin was standing in that space. Clara didn't fight her directly. That wasn't her style. She fought sideways, through efficiency, through the silent demonstration of how things had always been done, through the management of information. She knew where every item in the house lived, every child's preference, every quirk of the stove and the pantry and the schedule, and she did not volunteer this information. Marin had to learn it by doing things wrong first. The coffee was a good example. On the third morning, Marin made the coffee the way she'd always made it. Strong, dark, useful. Gideon came in, poured himself a cup, took a sip, and set it down. He didn't say anything. But Clara, who was already sitting at the table with her own cup, looked into her coffee with an expression that was just barely a smile. "He takes it weak," Nora said from the doorway, then disappeared. Marin made the coffee weaker the next morning. Gideon took a sip and gave a small nod that meant nothing except that the problem had been solved. But even that small correction, the fact that she'd needed correcting at all, felt like a loss she couldn't afford. She was aware that she was being watched and measured, and that the margin for error was not large. The community made sure she understood this too. She'd been at the ranch 8 days when she drove the wagon into Caldwell Creek for supplies. Gideon had given her a list and money and the wagon, and she'd gone alone, which was its own kind of test she hadn't quite anticipated. The town was small enough that everyone knew the Ashcroft wagon, and the woman driving it was not Clara, and news of what had happened at the auction had traveled in the way that news travels in small places, completely and with embellishment. At the general store, a woman named Ruth Pierce, stout, sharp-faced, the kind of woman who functions as the town's unofficial record keeper, looked Marin up and down while her order was being filled and said, with a smile that didn't reach anything above her mouth, "How are you finding things out at the Ashcroft place?" "Fine," Marin said. The last girl, the third one, she said those children were feral. I told her you can't really blame them, given everything. But still. Ruth Pierce shook her head with practiced sympathy. "It's a lot for anyone to take on." "It's a job," Marin said. "I'm doing it." Ruth Pierce's smile adjusted slightly. "Of course. We all thought it was brave of Gideon to try again, after the last time." She paused, letting the pause do its work. "I just hope it goes better this time, for everyone's sake." Marin paid for her supplies, loaded the wagon, and drove back to the ranch with her jaw set and her eyes on the road. The sky was low and gray, and the wind had that particular smell, sharp and mineral, that she would later learn meant weather coming. She spent that evening thinking not about Ruth Pierce, but about the smokehouse door. The frame had shifted, she'd already established that. What she needed was someone who could help her rehang it properly before the temperatures dropped another 10 degrees, and whatever was in the smokehouse became the only meat the family had until spring. She thought about asking Gideon, then didn't. He was up before her every morning and came in after dark, and the number of things already demanding his attention was visible in the way he moved, with the particular weariness of a man who has been doing the work of 3 people for years and has simply incorporated the exhaustion into his posture. She asked James instead. She found him in the barn on Saturday afternoon, mending a bridle with the focused irritation of someone doing a task they resent. "I need help rehanging the smokehouse door," she said. "It'll take about an hour with 2 people. An afternoon alone." James looked up. "That's not—" he started, then stopped. "It's not your job," Marin agreed. "I know, I'm asking anyway." He looked at her for a moment with the 16-year-old's reflexive calculation of what saying yes would cost him in terms of social positioning. Then he set down the bridle. "I'll need the right tools. Tell me what you need and I'll get them." They spent 90 minutes on the smokehouse door that Saturday. James didn't talk much, but he worked well, efficiently, without being told twice, and by the time they rehung the door and it latched properly on the first try, something had shifted in the air between them. Not warmth exactly, more like a mutual acknowledgement that they were capable of being useful to each other. "The fence on the north pasture is worse," James said, testing the latch one more time. "I know, I saw it. Papa keeps saying he'll get to it." "He will," Marin said. "Or we will. We'll figure it out." James looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not friendly, but something other than hostile. He picked up his tools and went back to the barn. November arrived in a bad mood. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 days and stayed there. The sky went the color of iron and produced occasional gusts of snow that weren't quite storms but were enough to make outdoor work miserable and to remind everyone on the ranch that the real weather was coming and they were not entirely ready for it. The situation in the kitchen became more complicated. Marin had been making quiet adjustments to the household, small things, practical things, the kind of changes that don't announce themselves. She reorganized the mending basket so the most urgent repairs were on top. She established a rotation for the older children's chores so that no single task fell to the same person every week, which had been causing low-grade resentment. She started drying herbs from the kitchen garden before the frost took them entirely, hanging them in bundles from the kitchen ceiling where they filled the room with a smell that was warmer than anything else in the house. Clara noticed all of it. The confrontation when it came was a Tuesday morning with snow on the ground and all 9 children at the table for breakfast, which meant there was no privacy and no good timing, and Clara had apparently decided she didn't need either. "You moved the preserves," Clara said. She was standing at the pantry with her back to the room. "I reorganized them," Marin said. "By what needs to be used first. We have 3 jars of green beans from last summer that need to go before—" "I know what needs to go." Clara turned around. Her voice was controlled but tight in the way that something is tight when it's close to its limit. "I know every jar in this pantry. I know every piece of fabric in the mending basket and every crack in this floor, and I have been keeping this family alive while you were—" She stopped. The table was silent. Even May and Josie had stopped moving. "While I was somewhere else," Marin said quietly. "I know. You've been here 2 weeks." "I have." The last woman rearranged the kitchen too. Clara's voice had flattened out into something colder. She left 11 days later. "Clara!" That was Gideon's voice from the doorway to the hall. No one had heard him come in from the barn. He stood there in his coat with mud on his boots, and his expression said that he had been standing there long enough to hear most of it. "Enough!" "I'm not trying to erase what you've done," Marin said, before Gideon could say anything else. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Clara. "I mean that. What you've kept going here, by yourself at your age, that's real. I'm not pretending it isn't, but I need you to hear me when I say that it should not have been yours to carry alone. That's not a criticism. It's just true." Clara stared at her. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with anger, something rawer than anger, something younger. "You don't know anything about what it's been," she said. "You're right," Marin said. "Tell me." Clara blinked. Whatever she'd prepared for, it wasn't that. The moment held for a long beat. Too many people in the room, too much weight in the air. The smell of burning porridge starting to rise from the pot Marin had forgotten. and then Clara turned away and walked out the back door and let it close behind her with a sound that wasn't quite a slam but was close enough. Marin took the porridge off the heat. She became aware that 8 children were looking at her with varying degrees of alarm. "Eat your breakfast," she said. "It's getting cold." They ate. Gideon stayed in the doorway for another moment, then came into the kitchen and poured himself the weak coffee without being asked and sat at the end of the table. He didn't offer Marin any commentary. She didn't ask for any. They existed in the same room, in the same difficult silence that was, she was beginning to understand, the primary language of this household. Not cruelty, not warmth, just the compressed practicality of people who have too much to do and not enough time to process what they feel about it. Clara didn't come back inside for 2 hours. When she did, she said nothing about what had happened. She took the bread Marin had proofing and shaped it without being asked and put it in the oven at the right temperature. And she did it with the focused efficiency of someone who is using work as a wall. Marin let her. The wall was real, and it was earned, and the only way past a wall like that is to be consistently present on the other side of it for long enough that the person inside decides, on their own, that the wall costs more than it protects. She didn't know if she'd be there long enough for that to happen. She pushed the thought aside and went to check on Nora, who had been coughing since Monday. Nora was in the room she shared with the twins, sitting at the window with a blanket around her shoulders and a book open in her lap that she clearly hadn't been reading. Her color was off, not sick enough to be alarming, but the kind of pale that meant she'd been fighting something for a few days and hadn't said anything because saying something required telling an adult, and the adults available were already overwhelmed. "How long have you had the cough?" Marin asked. Nora shrugged. "A while." "Since when is a while?" "Last week." Marin touched the back of her hand to the girl's forehead. "Warm. Not burning, but warm." "Do you hurt anywhere?" "My chest a little." She said it carefully, the way a child says a thing they weren't going to say. Marin made her a steam tent with a pot of boiling water and a blanket pulled over her head at the table, and added dried thyme from the bundles hanging in the kitchen, and sat with her while she breathed it in. Nora didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, from under the blanket, "The third lady, Mrs. Bauer, she was scared of the dark. Did you know that?" "I didn't," Marin said. "She never said so, but she kept a lamp burning all night, and it woke Josie up, and Josie cried, and Mrs. Bauer cried too sometimes, at night when she thought nobody heard." A pause. "I heard." Marin was quiet. "She wasn't bad," Nora said. She wasn't right for here." "A lot of places aren't right for a lot of people," Marin said. Nora pulled the blanket back from her head and looked at Marin with the particular directness of a 12-year-old who has decided to ask the thing they've actually been thinking. "Are you right for here?" Marin considered lying. It would have been easy and not unkind. She said instead, "I don't know yet. I'm finding out." Nora looked at her for a moment, then put the blanket back over her head. 2 days later, her cough was better. She didn't go back to avoiding Marin with the same systematic energy as before. It wasn't friendship, but she stopped taking the long way through the kitchen. The town's opinion of Marin did not improve through November. Ruth Pierce had apparently made it her business to track the situation at the Ashcroft Ranch the way other people track weather patterns, with attention, with prediction, and with a certain investment in being right about the outcome. When Marin came into town a second time, the atmosphere in the general store had the quality of a room where conversation has just stopped. She bought what she needed, said nothing unnecessary, and drove home. On the road back, she passed a wagon going the other direction driven by a man named Carroll, who owned land 2 miles south of the Ashcrofts. He slowed his horses and looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "You still out there at Ashcroft's place?" he said. "Still here," she said. He seemed to find this mildly surprising. He clicked his horses forward without another word. She drove the rest of the way home, thinking about the smokehouse and the fence on the north pasture and the fact that Thomas had been struggling with his arithmetic since September, and nobody had noticed because Clara was managing 5 other things at any given moment, and Gideon came home after dark. She thought about the way Eli had started sitting at the kitchen table every morning, doing his schoolwork while she cooked, not asking for anything but present in the way that children are present when they're deciding whether a place is safe. She thought about how a household is not a thing you fix the way you fix a door, all at once, with the right tools, until the latch catches clean. It's more like ground you prepare, where you do the invisible work for weeks and nothing shows, and then one morning something is growing that wasn't there before and you almost missed it. When she got back to the ranch, Samuel was in the yard with a length of rope, trying to show May how to tie a knot he'd learned from Henry. It wasn't working. He was getting frustrated, and she was getting giggling, and when Marin pulled the wagon in, Samuel looked up with the expression of someone who has just realized they might need assistance. "Do you know any good knots?" he asked her. Marin set the brake on the wagon. "A few." "Can you show me the one that doesn't slip, the knot that holds?" She climbed down from the wagon. The afternoon was cold and flat, and the light was already going thin the way it did in November, draining out of the sky an hour earlier than felt fair. "Come here," she said. He brought her the rope, and she sat down on the porch steps in the cold and showed him, her thick fingers moving slowly so he could follow, and May crowded in beside him because she wanted to see too, and by the time Josie appeared from somewhere and wedged herself between her sister and the porch rail, Marin had 3 children sitting in a row watching her hands, and the cold didn't matter much, and the thin light didn't matter much either. She taught them the knot that holds. She taught them twice, until they had it. The smell came first. Marin noticed it on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December. A particular quality to the cold air that she couldn't name exactly, but that registered somewhere below conscious thought, the way a sound registers before you know you've heard it. The sky to the northwest had gone a color that had no business being in a sky, a deep yellowish gray that sat too low and too still. She stood on the porch for a moment with a bucket in her hand and looked at it. Thomas came out behind her, heading for the barn. He stopped. "That's bad," he said. For a 12-year-old boy who rarely offered opinions about anything, the statement carried weight. "How bad?" Marin asked. "Papa says when the sky goes that color you nail down what you can and bring in everything else." He paused. "Last time it looked like that, we lost the northeast fence and 2 chickens. Marin set down the bucket. "Go get your father." Gideon was already coming in from the north pasture when Thomas found him. He'd seen the sky too, had probably seen it before Marin had, and he came in at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything short of it. He stood in the yard and looked northwest for about 4 seconds, which seemed to be enough. "James, Henry," he called toward the barn, "get the horses in, all of them. Secure the barn doors with the crossbeam, both of them." He turned to Marin. "What's in the smokehouse?" 3 hams, 2 sides of bacon, the last of the venison, and 4 ropes of dried sausage. He absorbed this. "Bring it all into the house. Everything. Root cellar too. Bring up everything that'll freeze if it gets below 0 in there, and it will." He was already moving toward the barn. Over his shoulder, "We've got maybe 6 hours, maybe less." 6 hours was not enough time. It was enough time to do most of what needed doing, which was different. Marin went to the smokehouse first. She made 3 trips, carrying what she could each time, and on the second trip she found Eli and Samuel waiting outside the smokehouse door with their arms out. "Tell us what to take," Eli said. She didn't waste time asking how they knew. She handed them what they could carry and sent them to the kitchen and went back for the rest. Clara was in the kitchen when Marin brought the first load in. She took one look at the meat in Marin's arms and the expression on her face and said nothing at all. She just opened the larder and started rearranging to make space, moving with the efficient decisiveness of someone who has been through bad weather before and knows what it asks of you. It was the first time they had worked side by side without the air between them feeling like a border. They didn't have time to notice it. The root cellar took 3 trips between Marin and Clara both, hauling up the squash and the remaining potatoes and the jars of preserved things that could not survive a freeze. The younger children were brought inside and told to stay there. The twins were given the job of stacking firewood inside the back door, a task they took seriously enough that by the time the first real wind hit, there was a wall of split wood 3 feet high along the kitchen wall, which was more than Marin had asked for and exactly what they needed. The storm came in the late afternoon. It didn't announce itself dramatically. There was no single moment of arrival, just a gradual, relentless thickening of the world outside until the barn disappeared and then the fence post disappeared, And then there was simply nothing beyond the glass but white and gray, and the howling that had started somewhere in the northwest and was now everywhere at once, coming from no direction and every direction simultaneously. The temperature inside the house dropped 4 degrees in an hour. Gideon came in from the barn with ice in his beard and his coat frozen stiff at the sleeves. He stood in the kitchen and dripped meltwater on the floor and said, "The barn doors are holding. I blocked the gap under the north door with sacking." He looked at the firewood stacked against the wall. Then he looked at the twins, who were sitting at the table with identical expressions of exhausted pride. "Good work," he said. May and Josie looked at each other and then at Marin, as if confirming that the praise had happened. "We need to talk about heat," Marin said to Gideon. "One fire won't do it. There's the parlor stove. And the upstairs?" The second floor had no heating source except what rose through the floorboards from below, which was insufficient under normal circumstances and would be dangerous in this. "The little ones can't sleep up there tonight." Gideon looked at the ceiling, running calculations she couldn't see. "We can move the pallets down." "The parlor and the kitchen," Marin said. "Everyone in 2 rooms. It's warmer with bodies together, and it means we're only heating 2 spaces." He looked at her for a moment, not skeptically, but with the particular attention of a man who is evaluating whether the person talking knows what they're saying. "All right," he said. That was how 9 children and 2 adults spent the first night of the blizzard. The younger 5 on pallets in the parlor around the stove, the older 4 and Marin in the kitchen, Gideon moving between them on a rotation that had him up most of the night tending fires. Marin took the second rotation, 2 to 5 in the morning, without being asked, letting him sleep 3 hours in the chair by the kitchen range, and she sat in the cold dark between stoking the fires and listened to the storm dismantle the world outside, and thought with precise, deliberate focus about what they had and what they needed. Food was the first calculation. She went through the inventory in her head the way she'd organized it in the larder, assigning weights and portions and estimating days. What she had was enough, if used carefully. If this lasted a week, which frontier blizzards could, she would need to stretch the proteins further than felt comfortable, supplement with the dried beans she'd moved up from the cellar, and manage the bread flour with discipline. The children would complain about the food. That was survivable. Water was the second calculation. The well would freeze or be inaccessible if the snow drifted high enough, which it would. She'd filled every pot and bucket before the storm hit. Gideon had done the same, she'd noticed, without them having discussed it, which told her something about how long he'd been managing crises alone. They had enough for 3 days if they were careful. After that, snow could be melted, which was slow but reliable. Warmth was the third calculation, and the most serious. They had a good supply of firewood, but the storm was pulling heat out of the house faster than she'd anticipated. The gap under the front door was leaking cold air at a rate that made the parlor stove work twice as hard. Marin found an old wool blanket in the chest at the bottom of the stairs and rolled it tight and pressed it against the base of the door, and then she did the same with rags at the 2 windows in the parlor that had always sealed badly. It helped. Not enough, but some. The second day was harder than the first. The children, who had initially found the situation exciting in the way that children find emergencies exciting before the duration becomes apparent, began to feel the weight of confinement. The parlor was too small for 5 children to occupy comfortably, and by mid-morning there had been 2 arguments, one incident involving Samuel throwing a tin cup at Henry's head, which missed, but only barely, and Josie crying because she couldn't find the doll she'd left upstairs, and no one was allowed upstairs because the temperature up there was now somewhere the other side of bearable. Marin found the doll. She went up herself fast, wrapped in her coat, and retrieved it from under the bed where it had fallen, and came back down with her face red from cold and handed it to Josie without ceremony. Josie looked at her with those serious 6-year-old eyes. "Thank you," she said, very precisely, the way children say things they mean to mean. Marin moved on before she could make anything of it. The arguments between the children were harder to manage than the cold. She had no authority she hadn't earned, and in a crisis, children test the edges of everything. Samuel was difficult. He was 8 years old and scared and expressing it sideways through aggression and complaint and a restless energy that had nowhere to go in a house locked down by a blizzard. Henry, at 14, was old enough to be useful and young enough to be irritable about being told so. James had withdrawn into a kind of deliberate stillness that Marin recognized as a coping mechanism. He was keeping himself quiet to keep himself from falling apart, which was functional but meant he was no help managing anyone else. She put James in charge of the fire rotation. It was a calculated decision. He needed something concrete, something with clear stakes and measurable outcomes. Keep the fires burning at the right level, neither so low they cooled down, nor so high they burned through the wood too fast. She explained what she needed and why, and he listened with the focused expression of someone grateful to have a task that had a right answer. He did not miss a rotation for 3 days. Nora turned out to be the unexpected steadiness. The 12-year-old who had spent weeks avoiding Marin materialized on the second day of the storm with a calm that seemed to come from somewhere older than her age. She sat with the twins when they got scared and told them stories, not made-up ones, but real stories, things she remembered, which was somehow better. She helped Marin with meals without being asked. She didn't complain. On the second night, when Marin was in the kitchen making weak broth from the ham bone to stretch the food further, Nora came in and sat at the table. "Is it going to be all right?" she asked. Marin looked up from the pot. She could have said yes immediately. That was the easier answer. "I think so," she said. "If we're careful." "What if the wood runs out?" "It won't, not if James keeps the rotation right." She paused. "And he will." Nora was quiet for a moment. "He's scared." "I know." "He doesn't show it." "That's his way," Marin said. "It doesn't mean it's not there." Nora nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd been working out herself. Then she picked up a spoon and helped stir the broth without being asked, and they worked together in the near-dark kitchen with the storm pressing against the house from all sides. The third day, Clara broke. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no raised voice. She broke the way things break when they've been under sustained pressure for too long, and finally reach a point that the structure can no longer absorb. Marin found her in the pantry on the morning of the third day, standing in front of the shelves with her arms crossed over her chest and her face turned away, and Marin could see from the set of her shoulders that she was crying, or had been, or was on the edge of it. She didn't say anything. She went into the pantry to get the flour she needed, and she was aware of Clara standing there, and she measured out the flour and put it in the bowl, and then she said quietly, "You've been holding this family together for 3 years." Clara didn't turn around. "That's too long to carry something that heavy without setting it down sometimes," Marin said. A silence. Then Clara said, with her voice controlled and her back still turned, "What if I set it down and something goes wrong?" "Something's already going wrong. There's a blizzard outside." Clara stopped. What if I stop and everything falls apart?" "It won't fall apart," Marin said, "because you're not the only one holding it anymore." Another silence, longer this time. Clara turned around. Her eyes were red, but her face was composed. The composure of someone who has had a great deal of practice not letting the wrong things show. "You don't know that you're staying," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to an honest fear. Marin looked at her. She thought about saying something certain, something reassuring and clean. She didn't. "I know that I'm here right now," she said, "and right now is what we've got." Clara pressed her lips together. She nodded once, very slightly. She came out of the pantry and made biscuits from the flour Marin had measured, and her hands were steady, and she didn't leave the room. On the fourth day, Gideon pulled a muscle in his lower back, moving a drift of snow away from the barn door. He came inside trying not to show it, which fooled none of the children and certainly didn't fool Marin, who had watched enough people try to hide pain to recognize the particular way a person holds themselves when their back is wrong. She said nothing in front of the children. She got him sitting at the kitchen table and put a heated cloth, a rag warmed on the range, against the spot he was pretending didn't hurt. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said. "You'll be fine in 2 days if you don't make it worse. That's different." He looked at her over his shoulder with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being managed. "The barn. James is in the barn. Henry's with him. They know what to do." She adjusted the heated cloth. "The best thing you can do for this family right now is sit down." He sat down. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You reorganized the food stores." 3 days ago, before the storm. I saw the portions." He was looking at the table. "You stretched it right." We'll run short on flour by day 7 if it goes that long. Not short enough to be a real problem if I'm careful with it. Gideon nodded slowly. How are the children? Tired. Scared, some of them, though they won't say so. Thomas has been quiet. She paused. He's the one I watch. The quiet ones in a crisis carry more than they let on. He's like his mother was, Gideon said. The words came out evenly, but there was something in them, a weight that had been living there for 3 years and had simply become part of how he spoke. She held things inside. Marin didn't ask more. She moved the cloth and rewarmed it on the range. When she put it back, she said, He drew something yesterday. I found it on the kitchen table. He left it there. Didn't say it was for anyone. It was the house, this house, with the barn in the background and snow all around it, and all the windows were lit up. Gideon didn't say anything for a moment. He drew that? He's good, Marin said. You know that? I didn't know he was still drawing. She let that sit where it landed. On the morning of the 5th day, the storm began to exhaust itself. The sound changed first. The constant, formless roaring that had become the house's background noise for 4 days shifted to something intermittent, with gaps between the gusts, and in those gaps there was a quality of silence so absolute it was almost loud. Eli heard it first. He sat up from his pallet in the kitchen and said, It's stopping. Not yet, Marin said. Go back to sleep. But he was right that it was changing. By noon the wind had dropped to something survivable, and by mid-afternoon Gideon was able to open the front door and stand on the porch in knee-deep snow and look at the ranch. The damage was visible immediately. The smokehouse roof had taken a hit from something. A branch, they found later, from one of the cottonwoods along the drive. 2 fence sections on the south side were down, posts snapped clean off. The chicken coop had drifted in so completely that the door couldn't open, and somewhere inside the muffled structure, the surviving chickens were making sounds that indicated displeasure, but not death. The barn was standing. The house was standing. All 9 children were alive, irritable, hungry for something other than bean soup and biscuits. And in the case of the twins, engaged in an argument about whose turn it was to hold the doll that had reached a pitch and duration that suggested it had started sometime around day 2 and hadn't really stopped. Marin stood on the porch next to Gideon and looked at the broken fences and the drifted snow and the bent cottonwood tree and the chicken coop that needed digging out immediately, and she felt the cold in her face and her hands and the particular tiredness that lives in your legs after 5 days of constant management, and she thought, we made it through. She didn't say it out loud. It seemed like the kind of thing that was true whether or not you said it. Behind them, through the kitchen window, she could hear Samuel and Henry arguing about something, and Claire's voice cutting across both of them with the flat authority she'd been using her whole life. And the twins' argument about the doll resolving itself somehow into shared laughter, the way twins' arguments sometimes do. And the sound of all of it, the arguing and the laughter and the particular domestic noise of 9 people in too small a space, was not peaceful and was not tidy and was not any version of the word fine. But it was present. It was ongoing. It was alive. Gideon cleared his throat. His back was still bothering him. She could see it in how he held himself. But he was standing straight, looking at what needed to be done next with the eyes of a man who has been calculating next steps his entire adult life. Fence first, he said. Then the coop. Roof on the smokehouse before the next weather comes, Marin said. Agreed. He paused. James can handle the coop if you show him what to check for. He can handle it without being shown. He knows. Gideon glanced at her sideways. Something crossed his face, something she couldn't quite read, somewhere between surprised and not surprised. You've been watching them. I've been here, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then the food held. Yes. You're rationing. Ours, she said. Clara knew what was in the pantry better than I did. I just did the math. The wind moved through the yard, still cold but no longer vicious, the last of the storm working itself out. Gideon looked at the bent cottonwood tree for a long moment. I misjudged the stores last year, he said. Came up short in February. Had to buy on credit from the Hanley Ranch. Marin looked at him. He was still looking at the tree. Next autumn, she said, we start earlier. Add another month's supply of flour and dried meat before first frost. He turned and looked at her then, fully, directly, in a way that he hadn't done since that first afternoon on the wagon when he'd told her the previous women had left. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you're revising an understanding you've had about them. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Behind them, the kitchen door opened and Eli's head appeared. "Marin, Samuel knocked over the water bucket and there's water all over the floor, and he's blaming May, but I saw him do it." Marin turned from the view of the broken fence and the surviving barn and the wide white territory that surrounded them all. "Get the mop," she said. "I'll be right in." She was right in. The fence repair took 4 days. Not because the work itself was that extensive, but because the ground beneath the snow was frozen to a depth that made resetting the posts a serious undertaking, and because Gideon's back required 2 more days of recovery before he could work at full capacity without risking something worse than a pulled muscle. James and Henry did the initial clearing and assessment. Marin helped haul replacement posts from the woodpile behind the barn, which she did without announcing she was going to do it, and which the boys accepted without comment because the storm had reorganized everyone's understanding of who did what and why. The ranch that emerged from under 5 days of blizzard looked like something that had survived a fight, bruised, slightly rearranged, with the particular haggard quality of a place that had been tested and had held but was not pretending the test hadn't happened. The bent cottonwood tree along the drive could not be saved. Gideon and James cut it down on the 3rd day after the storm, and the sound of the axe against frozen wood carried a long way in the cold, clear air, and when the tree came down, the twins watched from the kitchen window with expressions of solemn attention. "It was already sick," Thomas said, from behind them. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table with his drawing things, which had migrated permanently to the corner of the table that everyone had gradually accepted as his. "I saw the bark going wrong last summer." Marin had been nearby, mixing dough. "You noticed that?" "I noticed things," he said, without particular pride. Just a statement. She looked at the drawing he was working on, the ranch again, but from a different angle than the one she'd found during the storm. This one included the cottonwood tree, still standing, the way it had looked before. She didn't say anything about it. Some things a person doesn't need commentary on. January came in cleaner than December had ended, which wasn't saying much, but the sky at least stayed its proper color, and the temperatures held it miserable rather than dangerous. Life on the ranch settled back into its rhythms, but the rhythms were different now, in ways that were hard to point to directly. Small things. The way the older boys moved through the kitchen without the careful avoidance they'd maintained in the first weeks. They went where they needed to go now, and if Marin was in the way, they said, "Excuse me," and meant it, rather than performing it. The way the twins had started talking to her, the way they talked to each other, in the quick overlapping language of people who have decided you're safe enough to be themselves around. Samuel, who had spent the first 2 months of Marin's presence on the ranch in a state of low-grade antagonism that expressed itself mostly through noise and mess, had arrived at some private conclusion about her during the storm and had not gone back to his previous position. He was not an easy child. Marin had no illusions about that. He was loud and impulsive and prone to decisions that made sense to no adult mind but were completely internally consistent once you understood how he thought. She had spent considerable energy understanding how he thought. It helped. Not always, but enough. The arithmetic situation with Thomas had been resolved quietly, in the evenings after supper, when the younger children were in bed and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house. She sat with him 3 nights a week and went through his schoolwork without making it a lesson, just working through it together, the way you work through something with a person rather than at them. And Thomas, who was the kind of child who could not absorb information when he felt observed, but could absorb anything when he felt like a participant, had stopped struggling by the middle of January. "You could have been a teacher," he told her one evening, with the blunt sincerity that was his particular version of a compliment. "I thought about it once," she said. "What happened?" She considered how much of a true answer to give a 12-year-old. "Life went in a different direction," she said. He accepted this and returned to his arithmetic, and she returned to the mending in her lap, and the range ticked in the corner, and outside the January wind moved through the yard, but didn't come inside. Gideon noticed things changing the same way you notice a room has gotten warmer. Not at the moment it happens, but afterward, when you realize you've stopped being cold. He was not a man who made a practice of articulating what he observed about domestic arrangements. He watched, which was a different thing, and he made adjustments based on what he watched, which was how he had managed everything in his life since his wife died, and he had become both parents to 9 children on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. What he observed in January was that his children were fighting less. Not never. There were still arguments, still the periodic eruptions of temper that are simply the cost of 9 people sharing space under pressure. Samuel threw something at least once a week, a fact that had not changed and showed no signs of changing. The twins still conducted low-grade warfare over the doll with the regularity of a weather cycle. Henry and James had an ongoing dispute about the proper way to maintain a saddle that had apparently been running since the previous spring and might never fully resolve. But the persistent undertone of chaos that had characterized the household since their mother died, the feeling of a household that was running on improvisation and held together by the daily heroics of a 17-year-old girl, had changed to something that felt more like a place that knew what it was doing. Gideon said nothing about this for a long time. He said nothing, and he watched, and in the evenings he sat in the parlor chair with whatever needed mending or sharpening and listened to the sounds the house made with people living in it, and he thought about things he had no particular language for. Clara's change was the one he watched most carefully. It happened slowly enough that there was no single moment he could identify as the turning point. She was still Clara, still the backbone the family had organized itself around for 3 years, still precise, still inclined to manage things with an efficiency that sometimes read as coldness until you understood that the efficiency was how she cared. She had not become soft. She had not relaxed her standards. But something in her had released slightly, like a fist that has been held so long it can finally open a little without the whole arm shaking. She started sleeping later. Not much, 20 minutes, half an hour. But Marin had noticed in the first weeks that Clara was often already in the kitchen when Marin came down at 5, standing at the range with the look of someone who has not slept and is not going to admit it. That had stopped sometime in early January. The kitchen was Marin's in the mornings now, and Clara came down at 5:30 or 6, and she did not look like someone who had been awake since 3. It was Nora who said something about it first. She came into the kitchen one February morning while Marin was making corn mush for the younger children, and she stood at the window looking out at the white yard and said, without preamble, "Clara laughed yesterday." Marin stirred the pot. What did she laugh at? Eli was trying to show May the knot you taught him, and he got it wrong, and May did it right and wouldn't stop showing him. Nora paused. Clara laughed, not just a little, actually laughed. Good, Marin said. She doesn't do that much. I know. Nora was quiet for a moment, then, she said something about you last night, after you went to bed. Marin kept stirring. What did she say? She said you were stubborn. Nora said it carefully, monitoring Marin's face. But she said it the way she says it about Papa, like it's not a bad thing. Marin took the pot off the heat. Clara's stubborn too, she said. We understand each other. Nora seemed satisfied with this and went to set the table. The moment between Marin and Clara, when it came, was not announced. It was a Sunday afternoon in the middle of February, one of the rare days when the chores had been gotten through by midday and the light was good, thin winter light but clean, and Clara had gone to the room she shared with Nora and come back down with her mother's sewing basket, the one that lived on the high shelf in the parlor and was not touched except for the most serious mending. She sat at the kitchen table with it and opened it and took out a dress, a child's dress, small for the twins, with a tear along the side seam that had been sitting in the basket for longer than it should have, and she threaded a needle with the careful patience of someone who had been taught to sew properly and not forgotten it. Marin was at the other end of the table with her own mending. They worked in silence for a while. Then Clara said, without looking up, She taught me to sew. My mother. Marin did not react with the kind of careful delicacy that would have made the moment into something Clara would close around. She just said, She was good at it? Very good. She could do smocking. I never learned that part. Clara smoothed the fabric on the table. She said there'd be time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the boys were doing something in the yard that involved shouting, which was their default volume for any outdoor activity. What was she like? Marin asked. Clara was quiet long enough that Marin thought she might not answer. Then she said, She was tired a lot. That's what I remember most. She worked all the time, but she knew everyone's thing, Samuel's thing, Eli's thing. She knew what each of us needed when we were upset, and it wasn't the same for any of us. A pause. I tried to do that. After. But I don't always know. Nobody always knows, Marin said. You're better at it than I am. It came out plainly, without apparent difficulty, which told Marin that Clara had been sitting with the thought for a while before saying it, had decided in her careful private way that it was a thing that should be said rather than something that should stay inside. I've had more time to practice, Marin said, and I've only got them. You had them in the house, and the cooking, and the animals, and your own grief in the middle of all of it. That's not a fair comparison. Clara's needle moved through the fabric. I didn't grieve, she said. Not the way you're supposed to. There wasn't time. Marin looked at her. There's time now, she said. If you need it. Clara did not cry. She was not that kind of person, or she had not been that kind of person in so long that the distance from it was too great to cross at a kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, but something shifted in her face, something that was not dramatic and was not small, some interior rearrangement that was years overdue, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the dress she was mending with great attention. The smocking, she said after a moment. Do you know how to do it? Marin shook her head. Never learned. She left instructions. In the basket. Clara reached in and produced a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases from having been folded and unfolded many times. She smoothed it on the table between them. The handwriting on it was small and careful, in pencil that had faded but was still legible. I've read it 100 times. I can't make it make sense from words alone. Marin looked at the paper, then at Clara. We could try to figure it out together, she said. Clara looked at her for a moment, the same look she'd been giving Marin since the beginning, the evaluating one, the one that was asking a question that had nothing to do with smocking. Then she turned the paper so it faced them both equally. All right, she said. They did not figure out the smocking that afternoon. The instructions were unclear in places, and the fabric they were practicing on was not right, and they made several attempts that had to be undone. But they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours working on it, talking through the steps and disagreeing about the interpretation of certain phrases and starting over twice, and by the time supper needed to be started, they had not solved it, but they had made something else, something harder to name and more important. Gideon found them there when he came in from the barn. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of his oldest daughter and the woman he'd purchased at an auction in October, sitting at his kitchen table with their heads bent over a piece of paper, a half-finished piece of fabric between them. He could not see his wife's handwriting from where he stood. He didn't know that's what it was. He just saw Clara's posture, the particular way she was sitting, which was not the held-tight posture she'd carried for 3 years, not the braced, I am the only thing holding this together posture. And something in his chest moved in a way he hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. He set down what he was carrying and went to wash his hands. Clara looked up and said, Supper's going to be 20 minutes late. That's fine, he said. His voice came out slightly different than he'd intended, and he didn't explain it. That night, after the children were in bed, Gideon came into the kitchen where Marin was banking the fire for the night. This was not unusual. He often came through at the end of the evening, checking the range, the water supply, the small details that kept the household safe overnight. What was unusual was that he pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down. Marin glanced at him. She finished with the range and washed her hands and sat down across from him, because that was clearly what was happening. He looked at the table for a moment. Gideon Ashcroft was not a man who struggled for words exactly. He struggled with the decision to use them, which was different. When he spoke, what he said was considered and meant. He just didn't often decide it was worth the cost. I didn't know what I was doing when I bought your contract, he said. I know that, Marin said. I needed a body in the house, someone to keep things from falling apart. He paused. That's not what you've been. She waited. Clara, he started, then stopped. I've been watching Clara for 3 years and I didn't see what I was watching. I thought she was managing. I told myself she was managing. He looked up from the table. His eyes in the low light were a dark kind of honest. She was drowning, slow enough that I didn't see it because I was drowning too. And when everyone's underwater, you can't always tell. Marin said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't interrupt something that needed to finish. You saw it, he said. You came in from the outside and you saw it in a week. Sometimes that's what outside eyes are for, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not good at this, he said. Talking about... He gestured at the kitchen, which meant the house, which meant the family, which meant all of it. I know how to work. I know how to manage land and animals and weather. The rest of it I've been doing badly for 3 years and telling myself it was good enough. You kept them alive, Marin said. You kept the ranch. That's not nothing. It's not enough either. She looked at him. He was looking back at her now, directly, the way he had on the porch after the storm, like a man doing accounting on something that matters. I hired 4 women before you, he said. I told myself each time that if they couldn't handle it, it wasn't the right fit. I didn't ask what I could have done differently. A pause. I should have asked. What would you have done differently? Marin said. He thought about it seriously. Told the children it wasn't their job to drive them off, he said. Told Clara she didn't have to defend her territory. He paused. Told whoever came that the children weren't obstacles. They were the point. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Why didn't you? Because saying it meant admitting that my children were struggling, he said, and I wasn't ready to do that until it was impossible to pretend otherwise. The fire settled in the range. The house around them was quiet with the specific quiet of a house full of sleeping people. The contract runs until October, Marin said. I know. After that, I'm not obligated to stay. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you for a decision tonight. I'm just telling you. He stopped, started again. What you've built here, in this house, with these kids, that's not a thing you can buy for $15 in a 1-year contract. I didn't understand that in October. I understand it now. Marin sat with what he'd said for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the February night was deep and cold and indifferent, the way the frontier was always indifferent to the small human dramas taking place inside the structures people built against it. She thought about the platform in Caldwell Creek, the 30-degree wind, the man in the green coat who had bid $10 and looked away. She thought about a cot in a storage room and a rag stuffed in a gap at the bottom of a window, and 9 children with 9 different ways of needing things she hadn't known how to give them yet. She thought about Clara's face at the kitchen table with her mother's handwriting spread between them. I'll start planning next autumn's stores in March, she said. If we're going to have enough before first frost, we need to start early. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face. Not a smile exactly, but the landscape a smile comes from. March, he said. March, she said. He stood, pushed the chair back in, and went to check the back door lock the way he did every night. On his way out of the kitchen, he stopped in the doorway. The smokehouse roof needs to be done before April, he said. I know. I've been thinking about the angle. The original pitch shed snow wrong. He turned and looked at her. You've been thinking about the pitch. Since January. He was quiet for a beat. All right, he said. We'll fix the pitch. He went to bed. Marin sat at the kitchen table alone for a few more minutes, in the warmth of the banked fire, in the quiet of the sleeping house, in the particular stillness that comes after a conversation that has changed the weight of something without either person being able to say exactly what or when. She was tired in her legs and her back and her hands. She was, she realized, slowly, without ceremony, without the dramatic clarity of a moment she'd be able to point to later, not unhappy. That was new. It had been new for a while. She just hadn't stopped long enough to notice it until now. She banked the fire the rest of the way, checked the water, and went to bed. March came the way it always does on the frontier, not with warmth exactly, but with the suggestion of it. The snow didn't disappear so much as recede, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving behind mud and the gray-brown remnants of last year's grass, and the particular smell of ground that has been frozen for months and is beginning to remember what it's supposed to do. Marin noticed it on a Tuesday morning when she opened the back door to check the sky and felt something in the air that was different from the day before. Not warm, just less cold. A degree or two, maybe. But after a winter on the Flat Creek Road, a degree or two felt like news. She started the seed inventory that same week. It was earlier than anyone had done it before on the Ashcroft Ranch. She'd asked Gideon what the previous practice had been, and he'd said, with the candor that had become more characteristic of him since February, that the previous practice had been to deal with the seeds sometime in April, when the ground started looking ready, which meant they were always slightly behind in making decisions in a hurry. Marin spread what they had on the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon and went through it systematically, testing germination on the older stock, cataloging what was sufficient and what needed to be replaced. Clara sat across from her and helped without being asked, sorting, labeling, recording quantities in the household ledger in her small, precise handwriting. "We're short on squash," Clara said. "I know, and the beanstalk from last year is mostly gone. We'll need to buy before planting." Marin turned over a handful of corn seed, checking the quality. "I want to expand the kitchen garden on the east side. There's enough light there and the drainage is better than the south plot. That's an extra 2 days of breaking ground. James and Henry can do it, or we all do it together in a morning." She looked at Clara. "It'll mean more put up in the fall. Enough that we don't come up short in February the way your father said you did last year." Clara wrote something in the ledger. "He told you about that?" "He mentioned it. He doesn't usually..." She paused. "He doesn't usually tell people about the hard parts." Marin said nothing. She kept sorting seeds. Clara looked at the ledger for a moment, then she looked up. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. The question came out the way Clara's important questions always did, plainly, without the hedging that would have made it easier to deflect. "After October, when the contract's done." Marin set down the corn seed. She and Clara looked at each other across the kitchen table with its spread of seed packets, and the household ledger, and the 3 years of hard living between them and the 6 months since October that had built something she didn't have a clean word for. "I'm planning the fall stores," Marin said. "Does that answer the question?" Clara held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the ledger. "I'll add an extra column for the expanded garden," she said. It was for Clara Ashcroft the equivalent of a speech. The change in the community happened the way most changes happen when people are reluctant to make them, gradually, and then all at once, prompted by something concrete enough that it couldn't be argued with. The concrete thing was Carol, Daniel Carroll, who farmed 2 miles south of the Ashcrofts, and who had passed Marin on the road in November with the mildly surprised expression of a man who had expected her to be gone by then, lost 2 of his horses to colic in early March, and was facing spring planting without adequate draft power. It was a serious problem. On the frontier, serious problems had a way of becoming everyone's problem if you let them get bad enough. A failed farm was a gap in the community's collective ability to survive, and enough gaps and the whole fabric got thin. Gideon heard about it on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, he had driven over to the Carroll place to see what could be done. What could be done, as it turned out, involved a loan of one of the Ashcroft horses for the duration of planting season, which Gideon offered. But it also involved a conversation about the blizzard. Carol had barely heard about what had happened at the Ashcroft Ranch during those 5 days, the details having traveled imperfectly through the community as details do in winter when people are too cold and too busy to spread them thoroughly. Gideon told him. He told it the way Gideon told things, plainly, without elaboration, which made what he said land with more weight than embellishment would have. Carol drove out to the Ashcroft Ranch the following Saturday, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the horse. He arrived to find Marin directing Eli and Thomas on the repair of the smokehouse roof, the pitch correction that she and Gideon had discussed in February. She was on the ground giving angles. The boys were on the roof doing the actual work. She was not telling them what to do so much as talking them through what they were trying to accomplish and letting them figure out the execution. Carol watched for a few minutes from his wagon before he climbed down. He introduced himself. They had not formally met, only passed on the road, and Marin shook his hand and said she'd heard about his horses and she was sorry. "Gideon said you managed the food through the storm," he said. He said it the way a man says something he's been working out whether to bring up. "We managed it together," she said. He looked at the boys on the roof. He looked at the smokehouse. He looked at the yard, which was still the mud and late winter chaos of any working ranch in March, but had a kind of organized chaos to it that was different from what he'd seen the previous fall when he'd stopped by to return a borrowed tool and found the place in the specific disorder of a household that has too many people in it and not enough system. "You're good at this," he said. He said it with the slight discomfort of a man saying something he hadn't intended to say. "I work at it," Marin said. He nodded slowly. He helped hold the base of a ladder for 20 minutes while Eli adjusted a roof plank, because it needed doing and he was standing there. And when he left, he said to Gideon that he thought things were going to be all right out on the Flat Creek Road, and he said it in a way that meant he had revised a previous position. Word moved from Carol the way it moves in small places, gathering detail as it goes. Ruth Pierce heard from Carol's wife, who had heard from Carol. She heard it differently than Carol had said it, with more color, more drama, the 5-day blizzard expanding in the telling to something nearly apocalyptic, Marin's role in it sharpening to a narrative shape that real life rarely holds. Marin had saved the children. Marin had kept them all alive. Marin had done what no one expected. Ruth Pierce arrived at the Ashcroft Ranch on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of March, without warning, carrying a pie. It was a good pie. Marin could tell that from the crust, which was properly done and not an afterthought. She accepted it with the plain courtesy it deserved and invited Ruth Pierce to sit down and have coffee, which Ruth Pierce did with the expression of someone who had rehearsed a different reception and was recalibrating. "I hear you had a time of it this winter," Ruth Pierce said. "Most people did," Marin said. "The Ashcroft place especially." "We managed." Ruth Pierce wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment in the way that a person is quiet when they've come to say something and are deciding whether to actually say it. "I may have been," she started, "last fall, when you were first here. I may have said things that weren't generous." "You did," Marin said. Ruth Pierce looked at her. She had expected more friction or less, apparently, and the plain agreement seemed to unsettle her. "I judged the situation without knowing it," she said. "Most people did," Marin said again. "It's not unusual." "You're not angry?" "I don't have the time for it." Marin refilled Ruth Pierce's coffee. "Anger's expensive. I've got a garden to plan." Ruth Pierce left an hour later, not entirely sure what had happened, but knowing that something had. She told people in town that Marin Holloway was not at all what she'd assumed, which was not an apology exactly, but was the closest thing to one the community was going to produce. And it was enough. By April, the quality of the attention directed at the Ashcroft Ranch from Caldwell Creek had shifted from skeptical curiosity to something resembling respect, which on the frontier mostly expressed itself as people leaving you alone to do what you were clearly capable of doing. The spring itself was difficult in the ordinary ways. Mud, and the relentless work of a ranch emerging from winter, and the particular exhaustion of people who have been carrying a lot for a long time and can finally feel the weight lessening but can't quite put it down yet. The fence Carol had identified in November still needed work. The east side of the kitchen garden needed to be broken and turned. The smokehouse roof, once properly repitched, needed new shingles on the north face where the old ones had cracked during the freeze. There was always more. That was the nature of it. Marin had stopped expecting the work to end and had started thinking of it differently, not as a list to be completed, but as the texture of a life, the thing that fills days and gives them shape. On a ranch in 1884, you didn't finish. You maintained, you prepared, you anticipated, and you tried, where you could, to leave things slightly better than you found them. She was in the kitchen garden on a Friday afternoon in early April, turning the new east plot with a spade, when she heard the wagon coming up the drive. She straightened and looked up and recognized the horse before she recognized the driver, Henry's distinctive bay, the one that always tossed its head at the gate. James was driving. Henry was beside him, and in the back of the wagon were 4 lengths of new fencing post and a coil of wire, which meant they had gone to town on their own initiative to buy what was needed without being asked, which 6 months ago would not have happened. She watched them pull into the yard. "How was the road?" she called. "Muddy," James said. He climbed down and started unloading posts with the matter-of-fact efficiency he'd been developing since the smokehouse door in November. We stopped at the feed store. Hanley said to tell Papa the seed order's in. I'll tell him. Henry jumped down from the wagon and grabbed the coil of wire. He looked at the garden plot she'd been turning. You want help with that? Marin looked at Henry, 14 years old with mud on his boots and his hat pushed back and the expression of someone making an offer because they want to, not because they've been told to. When you've got the posts unloaded, she said. He nodded and went back to the wagon. She turned back to the garden and kept working. The evening in late April when Gideon asked her to marry him was not dramatic in any of the ways that the stories people tell about such moments tend to be. There was no particular setting arranged for it. It was after supper on a Thursday, with the dishes done and the younger children in bed and James and Henry out in the barn, finishing something they'd left unfinished before dark, and Clara and Nora sitting in the parlor with their mending. Gideon had come into the kitchen to bank the fire and found Marin at the table going through the household accounts, which had become her task sometime in March, when it had become evident that she had a more systematic approach to them than the previous arrangement. He sat down across from her. She looked up. His face had the look of a man who has made a decision and is now on the other side of the making of it, in the part where you have to say it out loud. I need to ask you something, he said. She set down her pencil. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. I told you in February I wasn't going to ask you for a decision that night. I'm asking now. He paused. I'm asking if you'd be willing to stay, not on a contract, not as an arrangement. He stopped, started again. I'm not good at talking about this kind of thing. I know, she said. I want you to stay because this is your home if you want it to be, because those children... He stopped. His jaw moved slightly. Because they're yours too, in the way that matters, which is that you chose them. Nobody made you do any of this. You could have done the minimum and collected your money and left in October and nobody would have said you were wrong. He looked at her steadily. You didn't do the minimum. Marin was quiet. I'm not asking out of gratitude, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking because you're the person I want at this table. You're the person I want making plans for next autumn and arguing with me about the smokehouse pitch and sitting up with sick children at 3 a.m. He paused. You're the person I want beside me when things go wrong, and they will go wrong. I can't promise you easy. I haven't asked for easy, she said. I know. He held her gaze. So I'm asking. Marin looked at him. She looked at this man who was not easy to know and not easy to live alongside, and who had spent 3 years doing everything alone and was still standing, which told her something about what he was made of. She thought about what she'd told Nora in November. I don't know yet. I'm finding out. She had found out. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Some of the held tension in his posture released, not dramatically, just the slight settling of a man who has been carrying something and has now set it down somewhere safe. All right, he said. All right, she said. In the parlor, Clara heard the quality of the silence change in the kitchen, heard it the way she heard everything in this house, because she had been paying attention to it for years, and she looked up from her mending. Nora was looking at her. What? Nora said. Clara looked back at her sewing. Nothing, she said, but she was not quite hiding a thing that was living at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the way a word has a shape before you say it. Nora looked at the kitchen doorway, then back at Clara. She understood enough. She looked back at her own mending and said nothing. When Marin came through the parlor 20 minutes later to check the front door latch, Clara looked up from her sewing. The squash seeds need to go in at the end of May, she said. Not June like we've been doing. June's too late for this soil. Marin stopped. She looked at Clara, this girl who had fought her and tested her, and quietly, in her own time, on her own terms, decided that Marin was someone worth letting in. End of May, she agreed. Clara looked back down at her sewing. Marin checked the latch and went to bed. On the last Sunday of April, the whole family was in the yard after the midday meal. No particular reason, just the pull of the first genuinely warm afternoon of the year, drawing everyone outside the way warmth does after a long winter. The older boys were doing something with a rope that had started as a demonstration of knot techniques and had evolved into something competitive. The twins were in the mud near the fence, which was going to be a problem for their dresses, but was not a problem yet. Thomas was sitting on the porch steps with his drawing things, capturing something. The yard, probably, with everyone in it. Nora was walking the perimeter of the kitchen garden with a stick, marking where the new rows would go. Maren stood near the porch with her face turned up to the afternoon sun, her eyes half closed, just feeling the warmth after the long cold. She heard Samuel before she saw him, the characteristic prelude to Samuel, which was a noise that preceded his physical presence by several seconds. He came around the corner of the house at speed for no apparent reason and nearly collided with her and stopped. He looked up at her. "I beat Eli at the knot," he said. "I heard," she said. She had not heard. "He said I cheated." "Did you?" Samuel considered this. "A little," he said. But the knot still held. She looked at him. This 8-year-old boy who was difficult and loud and impulsive and had thrown more things than she could count since October, and who had also, during 5 days of a blizzard, listened to everything she said without argument and helped carry things and kept his panic inside where it didn't infect the younger children, who was not simple, who was not easy, who was underneath all of it trying as hard as he could. "A knot that holds is a good knot," she said. He considered this judgment satisfactory and went back around the corner of the house. Maren looked at the yard, at all of it. The mud and the patched fence and the porch with its replaced plank and the washing on the line and the children scattered across the afternoon like something that had grown here, rooted here, become part of the place. She thought about the platform in Caldwell Creek, the October wind, the man who had bid $10 and looked away. She thought about what she had been when she arrived here, not what other people had seen when they looked at her, but what she had actually been. A person with nothing left, standing in the cold, waiting to find out if there was anything on the other side of that. There was this, not perfect, not finished, not without its hard mornings and its frictions and its moments of exhaustion so deep it felt structural, like something in the foundation. Gideon was still not easy to know. Clara still had days when the walls came back up, when something would remind her of the weight she'd carried, and she'd carry it alone for a while before she remembered she didn't have to. The older boys were not transformed. They were 16 and 14, and they were who they were, which was sometimes thoughtful and sometimes exactly as difficult as boys that age are supposed to be. None of it was resolved in the clean sense of the word. Life on the Flat Creek Road was going to keep asking things of everyone who lived it, and some of what it asked was going to be more than felt fair, and some winters were going to be harder than others, and the fence was always going to need work. But they were going to face it as something, not a collection of people living in proximity out of necessity. Something with more structure than that, more resilience, more shared history, more of the specific loyalty that builds up between people who have been through hard things together and didn't let go. Maren had not come to the Ashcroft Ranch looking for a family. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go, and a deputy with kind eyes had given her a choice between the platform and the workhouse. She had found something she hadn't known she was looking for, not because the frontier had been gentle with her, not because people had been quick to see her clearly, not because anything had been offered to her freely. She had found it because she had stayed, because every morning she had gotten up before 5 o'clock and made the fire and done what was needed and kept doing it when it was hard, and kept doing it when it was lonely, and kept doing it when the town laughed at her and the children didn't trust her and the wilderness pressed against the walls of the house like it was waiting for her to fail. The staying was the thing, not the arrival, not the moment of decision. The staying, day after day, when leaving would have been easier. That was what she had built here. Not a rescue, not a transformation, just the accumulated weight of showing up until showing up became belonging and belonging became home. Gideon came out of the barn and crossed the yard toward her, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at, the yard, the children, the wide afternoon opening up around the ranch in every direction. "Thomas is drawing us," Gideon said. Maren looked at the porch. Thomas had his head bent over his paper, his pencil moving. He hadn't looked up. "He'll make it look better than it is," she said. "That's what artists do," Gideon said. He paused. "I'm going to start on the north fence this week. The post at the corner is worse than I thought. I know, I saw it last week. Of course you did. He didn't say it with any edge, just the plain acknowledgement of who she was, someone who saw what needed to be done and noted it and dealt with it without needing to announce the process. They stood together in the April afternoon, side by side, not touching, with the yard full of their children, and the sky clear overhead, and the fence that needed work, and the garden that needed planting, and the 100 other things that would need doing tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that followed. None of it was easy. All of it was theirs. The wide western sky held the afternoon light for another hour before it started going gold at the edges, and on the porch steps, Thomas Ashcroft finished his drawing and looked up at what he'd been drawing and looked back down at the paper, making one small adjustment at the corner,